باسم آب وولد ومنفس قدوس أدواملا آمين. باسم آب وولد ومنفس قدوس أدواملا آمين. باسم آب وولد ومنفس قدوس أدواملا آمين. Good afternoon, and hope everyone's doing well on this Sabbath. So straight in with the reading, Numbers chapter 30, give thanks. Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes of the children of Israel, saying, "This is the thing which Yahweh has commanded. When a man vows a vow to Yahweh, or swears an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Also, when a woman vows a vow to Yahweh and binds herself by a pledge, being in her father's house in her youth, and her father hears her vow and her pledge with which she has bound her soul, and her father says nothing to her, then all her vows shall stand, and every pledge with which she has bound her soul shall stand. But if her father forbids her in the day that he hears, none of her vows or her pledges with which she has bound her soul shall stand. Yahweh will forgive her, because her father has forgiven her. If she has a husband, while her vows are on her, or the rash utterance of her lips with which she has bound her soul, and her husband hears it, and says nothing to her in the day that he hears it, then her vow shall stand, and her pledges with which she has bound her soul shall stand. But if her father forbids her in the day that he hears it, then he makes void her vow which is on her, and the I'll start that sentence again from verse number 8. But if her father forbids her in the day that he hears it, then he makes void her vow which is on her, and the rash utterance of her lips with which she has bound her soul. Yahweh will forgive her, but the vow of a widow or of her who is divorced, everything with which she has bound her soul shall stand against her. If she vowed in her husband's house, or bound her soul by a bond with an oath, and her husband hears it, and held his peace at her, and didn't disallow her, then all her vows shall stand, and every pledge with which she bound her soul shall stand. But if her husband made them full and null and void in the day when he heard them, then whenever proceeded out of her lips, and whatever that was, concerning her vows, or concerning the bond of her soul, shall not stand. Her husband has made them void. Yahweh will forgive her. Every vow and every binding path to afflict the soul, her husband may establish it, or her husband may make it void. But if her husband says nothing to her from day to day, then he establishes all her vows or all her pledges with which are on her. He has established them, because he has said nothing to her in the day that he heard them. But if he makes them null and void after he has heard them, then he shall bear her iniquity. These are the statutes which Yahweh commanded Moses between a man and his wife, between a father and his daughter, being in her youth and in her father's house. For these few words I give thanks, blessed love. So yes, some of that was a tongue twister. Apologise for tripping up a couple of times there. Yes, some of the sentence structure, is a bit roller coastery, convoluted. So, but I hope you got the gist. And the gist is quite striking, I guess, in terms of the fact that the women of the society at that time was very directly governed by the permission of the men, of the fathers and of the husbands. So it says, if a man makes a vow, then that vow stands, and he has to stand by that vow. But if a woman makes a vow to God, then if the father hears the vow and says nothing, then the vow stands. But if the father of the daughter hears the vow and says you can't do that, then it's null and void, and the woman isn't punished. If a wife makes a vow and the husband hears it and he's fine with it and doesn't say anything, then it's fine to go. But if a wife makes a vow and the husband hears it and doesn't agree, he can make that vow null and void. And again, the wife faces no punishment. But if a widow or divorced woman makes a vow, then it has to stand in the same way as a man's. And just so we're clear, if a man makes a vow and he doesn't honour the vow, then the penalty can be death, because there is punishment meted down by God on any vows that aren't seen through. And we have seen examples of that in the readings not so long ago, where someone made a vow and they didn't fulfill it and they were killed, basically. And in Ecclesiastes number 5, it does say that it's best that someone does not make a vow rather than make a vow and not fulfill it. God takes vows extremely seriously. And I think this is the nuance of this, because I think straight away we're asking, is this chapter sexist or not? And on face value, you could say, yes, it is sexist, because obviously it's the men and the husbands that are making the decisions for the woman and overriding any vows that they're making. So essentially they are like children in the household under the men, and their opinions aren't taken as seriously as the man's, and in the form of vows, because any father of an unmarried woman or any husband of a woman can make that vow null and void. So on that level it is sexist. But when you look at it, the structure of society was patriarchal, and that all of the liabilities of that household are on the men in that society. So that was the reality of the structure. We don't have to agree with it, but that was the reality of the structure. So within that framework of the patriarchal society, what this is actually doing is protecting households, because it's saying if a woman makes a vow and it's going to become a liability to the house, then there's a support mechanism for that vow to then become null and void. Whereas if the man makes a vow and he doesn't fulfill it, then actually the penalty is death or is other punishment, which actually does affect the whole house. But it's not affecting the whole house in the same way that the woman would be affecting the whole house, because often the women are the cornerstones of the house and actually they're the ones holding it together. So it is sexist on that level, but then it's also, there's a protection built in a patriarchal society to protect the women's decisions if they're not able to be fulfilled through and for the benefit of the family. So then there's kind of like this exit clause. So men are actually treated more harshly than the women, because they have to stand by their vows whether they see through it or not, where the women, you know, there is this breakout clause. If they don't fulfill them, etc., then they can be forgiven. So it's sexist, but it's also protecting women in that patriarchal structure at the same time. So there is a real nuance there. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And it's not about one cancelling out the other thing, because obviously we didn't want patriarchal societies in the first place, and everyone should be treated equal. And even Jesus saw to this in Matthew 5. He says, you know, let people's yeses be yeses and let no's be no. So let's get to that point of treating people equally. In Galatians, it moves more towards an equal society and people treated in a more equitable manner. So there is pushes of that within the Bible, but obviously there are some stark differences through the evolution of mankind, kind of as we know it. We've already seen some laws becoming much more progressive, particularly with Moses interceding on behalf of the people and saying, God, actually on this occasion, don't smite all of them, you know, let not the sins of one person be destruction of the whole nation. So then God said, okay, well, I'm just going to smite those few and not everybody, you know. So that is progress in that context. It's not progress today, but it's progress then, you know. So there is absolutely, I know the word evolution can be a bit sticky in religious discourse, but, you know, within this context, there is an evolution of thought, of development of different laws and progressiveness as it channels through the Bible. And we can say very starkly is the Old Testament, the old ways, and the New Testament, the new ways, but that's not always that helpful unless you kind of break it down. So I think it's interesting with this that it both is sexist, but there is also protection of the women built into the structure within a sexist society. There's these kind of get out of jail cards for women. So they're not punished in the same way as men if they're not able to fulfill the vows. So yeah, it's a convoluted one, but hopefully that reasoning kind of makes sense, if you like. But it is, yeah, it's not a catch-22, but it is it's a vicious circle. Do you know what I mean? There's lots of other analogies I could throw at it as well. So yeah, I'll end there really, because yeah, it's one of those ones that more to think about, but I'm not going to try and do all the job, and that's not my job here anyway. It's just to plant some seeds of thought. Is not necessary to provide answers. I actually did see a quote last night about the Bible, and it actually said the Bible is a book that raises questions. It doesn't give all the answers, and it wasn't designed to give all the answers. It's meant to raise these questions, and for humans to then have this question in mind of what it means to be living in the footsteps of, or in the motivation of praising the Most High. And it's for humans to start to navigate how best to do that and living alongside each other. But yeah, the Bible isn't a one size fits all, so it presents things in analogy and in story and in narratives, even in poetry when you get to Psalms. But it's not the whole list of the Bible is don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that, which we've seen some of that obviously in Exodus and Leviticus and a bit in Numbers, but that's not the totality of the experience of the Bible, which is much more about an analogy and metaphor and symbolism and these kind of things, because it's a continual growth, and I'm going to use the word again, it's a continual evolution of the mind, body, and spirit. So yes, give thanks and bless and love. Have a blessed rest of the Sabbath, and God willing, be back more tomorrow for more. Right, give thanks.